Put a successful adult on a luxury ship in the Mediterranean and watch how fast their logic center short-circuits. Suddenly, people are trying to outnegotiate gravity, applying corporate law to ancient ruins, and destroying their own dignity to save $12. Let's examine what happens when the peak of modern entitlement collides with the unforgiving reality of a floating hotel. 1. There is a specific psychological shift that occurs on the upper decks of a cruise ship, where the environment creates a sense of artificial scarcity that triggers a primal, territorial instinct in perfectly ordinary accountants and dentists, compelling them to claim temporary territory with the intensity of a ruthless corporate real estate developer. This brings us to Greg, a 55-year-old hardware store manager from Ontario, sailing on a mid-sized European cruise line out of Barcelona, who decided that securing prime real estate near the main Lido pool was not a matter of leisure, but an aggressive zoning dispute. The ship's written policy clearly stated that pool loungers could not be reserved with personal items for more than 30 minutes, a rule that Greg interpreted as a mere suggestion for the lower classes. On the second sea day, Greg awoke at precisely 4:43 a.m., slipped out of his cabin while his wife was still deep in REM sleep, and took the elevator up to Deck 11 carrying an absurd collection of mundane objects specifically curated to project the illusion of active human occupation. He didn't just drape a single blue towel over a chair like an amateur. He established a sprawling residential subdivision across 6 premium loungers right by the deep end. On chair 1, he placed a half-read legal thriller paperback, cracked open to page 204, as if the reader had just stepped away to use the restroom. On chair 2, he deposited a single, damp right water shoe. Chair 3 received a bottle of generic Factor 50 sunscreen and an empty coffee mug, while chairs 4, 5, and 6 were barricaded by a complex netting of cruise-issued towels twisted together like a privacy fence. Having secured his privatized estate, Greg then immediately returned to his cabin and went back to sleep for 4 straight hours. When he finally emerged at 9:15 a.m., wearing mirrored sunglasses and a tropical shirt unbuttoned dangerously close to his navel, he discovered that a French family of 4 had completely dismantled his carefully curated neighborhood, neatly stacking his thriller novel and single water shoe on a side table, and were currently occupying 4 of his claimed chairs. Instead of finding empty seats elsewhere on the massive vessel, Greg marched up to the father of the family, pointed a trembling finger at his displaced sunscreen, and loudly demanded to know why his active seating arrangement had been violated. When the French man simply shrugged and gestured to the surrounding signs about the 30-minute limit, Greg attempted to enforce property law himself by physically sitting down on the very edge of the lounger the French father was currently lying on, creating a deeply uncomfortable physical standoff. It took 2 deck stewards, a minor supervisor, and 20 minutes of heated negotiation to finally separate them, ending only when Greg was relocated to a shaded chair behind a structural pillar where he spent the rest of the afternoon aggressively glaring at the pool while guarding his single water shoe like a priceless artifact. 2. There is a specific kind of culinary panic that occurs when a passenger, heavily accustomed to a very narrow, predictable diet at home, is suddenly confronted with the realities of authentic European dining, resulting in behaviors that completely defy adult logic. During the first formal night on a cruise departing from Genoa, a 45-year-old tourist named Craig found himself seated at a large, shared table in the main dining room with his family and 2 other couples they had just met. Wanting to project the image of a sophisticated international traveler, Craig aggressively ordered the escargot appetizer, confidently telling the table that he loved exotic seafood. When the waiter arrived and placed the specialized ceramic dish in front of him, Craig looked down and completely short-circuited. Having absolutely no idea that escargots was the French term for snails, he assumed that a terrible, unsanitary mistake had occurred. Instead of quietly asking the waiter to take the dish back, Craig loudly gasped, pushed his chair back, and accused the kitchen staff of trying to feed him garden pests that had clearly crawled onto the ship while it was docked in Italy. The waiter, maintaining a flawless mask of professional courtesy, gently explained that it was a delicacy baked in garlic butter, but Craig was already in full survival mode. To the absolute horror of his wife and the complete bewilderment of the surrounding tables, Craig grabbed 3 empty crystal water glasses, turned them upside down, and slammed them over the ceramic dish, creating a makeshift glass prison. He loudly declared that he was trapping the creatures so they couldn't escape onto the table, aggressively demanding that the maitre d' come over immediately to document this severe maritime health violation, while his deeply mortified family slowly sank into their chairs, pretending they didn't know the man who was currently holding a plate of roasted garlic snails hostage. 3. Behavioral economics teaches us that human beings are deeply irrational when it comes to the concept of the sunk cost, often willing to endure extreme social discomfort purely to avoid the psychological pain of losing a perceived financial deal, which perfectly explains the disastrous afternoon experienced by a group of 4 friends in their early 40s from Chicago. Sarah, Mark, Chloe, and Dave were sailing on a brand new, heavily populated megaship doing a 7-day loop around the Greek Isles, and they had spent the first 3 days loudly complaining at the atrium bar about the $18 cost of the ship's signature cocktails. When the vessel docked in Crete, they hatched a master plan to cheat the maritime system. Because cruise line security rigidly scans all returning bags to confiscate outside alcohol, the group visited a local market and purchased 4 large, incredibly cheap bottles of local red wine for about €3 each. Realizing they couldn't just walk on board with them, they also purchased 4 large decorative metal tins of cheap artisanal olive oil. They went into a public restroom near the port, dumped all the olive oil down the sink, haphazardly rinsed the metal tins with cold tap water, and poured the cheap red wine inside. Their logic was airtight. The ship allowed passengers to bring back local olive oil as a souvenir, so they would simply walk their disguised wine right through the X-ray machine. What they failed to factor into their brilliant heist was that port security officers look at X-ray monitors for 10 hours a day, and they immediately noticed that the liquid inside the metal tins lacked the density of oil. The security officer pulled Dave's bag aside, tapped the tin, and asked what was inside. Dave, projecting the false confidence of a man who thinks he has outsmarted a multi-billion-dollar corporation, proudly declared it was cold-pressed, extra virgin olive oil for his mother. The officer calmly popped the seal on the tin, poured a tiny splash into a plastic cup, and revealed a vibrant purple-red liquid that smelled entirely of fermented grapes. Now, the standard procedure here is simple. Security holds the confiscated alcohol in a locker and returns it to you on the last morning of the cruise. But the sunk cost fallacy had already taken root in Dave's brain, and he refused to surrender his prize. The officer, realizing he was dealing with extremely stubborn tourists, offered them a loophole. Ship policy dictated that passengers could bring outside wine to the main dining room, provided they paid a strict $25 corkage fee per container to consume it on board. They had paid exactly €3 for the wine. The rational move was to let it go. Instead, driven purely by spite and a refusal to let the cruise line win, the group marched to the front desk, proudly paid $100 in corkage fees for $12 worth of wine, and received 4 bright orange stickers for their heavily dented metal tins. This brings us to the twist. That evening, it was formal night. The group arrived at the ship's most elegant dining room, dressed in cocktail attire, and smugly placed their 4 battered olive oil tins on the crisp white linen tablecloth. A highly trained French sommelier approached, maintaining a mask of total professional detachment, and used a specialized tool to pry the metal lids off. He then poured the vintage into their crystal goblets. As the group triumphantly raised their glasses to toast their financial genius, they took their first sip, only to discover a horrifying reality. Because they had only briefly rinsed the tins with cold bathroom tap water, a thick, greasy layer of residual olive fat had heavily emulsified into the cheap red wine. They were now holding crystal glasses filled with a cloudy, purple, heavily olive-flavored Italian dressing. Not wanting to admit defeat in front of the sommelier, who was watching them with quiet, devastating European politeness, the 4 friends spent the next 2 hours forcing down every drop of the greasy, savory wine, smiling rigidly through their greasy teeth, having successfully spent over $100 to drink a salad dressing. 4. There is a unique psychological phenomenon that occurs in the cruise ship casino, where the absence of natural sunlight and the gentle hum of the engines cause perfectly rational adults to invent deeply complex, pseudoscientific systems to exert control over basic probability. This brings us to a 60-year-old solo traveler named Arthur, who was sailing out of Venice and firmly believed that the automated coin pusher machine on Deck 7 operated based on the vibrational frequency of the ship's hull. Arthur didn't just casually drop quarters into the slot. He approached the brightly lit machine with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert. He spent roughly 40 minutes observing the exact rhythm of the sliding metal shelf, taking notes in a small spiral-bound ledger. Having determined the optimal drop window, Arthur refused to use his hands to insert his cruise card to get tokens, convinced that his body heat would disrupt the machine's delicate equilibrium. Instead, he withdrew a pair of long silver kitchen tongs from his jacket pocket, which he had quietly acquired from the salad station at the buffet, and attempted to delicately insert his plastic room key into the card reader from a distance of 2 feet. He stood there, dressed in a smart, casual polo shirt, performing this bizarre, long-distance operation with the tongs, creating an immediate queue of confused passengers behind him. When the casino manager approached and gently suggested that using culinary utensils on the electronic card reader was both unnecessary and unsanitary, Arthur sternly raised a hand to silence him. He explained with absolute unwavering seriousness that the static electricity transferred from human fingertips was intentionally designed by the cruise line to manipulate the coin pusher's microchips, and he was simply protecting his investment. He was allowed to continue his method purely out of the manager's morbid curiosity, eventually spending $50 in digital credit to win a small plastic keychain shaped like a dolphin, which he carefully extracted with the tongs, thoroughly convinced he had just bankrupted the house. 5. The intense isolation of a sea day often warps a passenger's perception of basic service protocols, leading them to believe that the ship's crew is not just there to assist them, but to engage in localized espionage on their behalf. Diane and Robert, a couple from the American Midwest celebrating their 30th anniversary on a massive megaship navigating the Adriatic Sea, encountered a minor inconvenience when the occupants of the cabin next to them began playing a television slightly too loud at 3 in the afternoon. Now, the standard, socially acceptable procedure here is to knock on the door or call guest services. Diane, however, opted for a deeply intense covert surveillance operation. She marched down to the front desk, bypassed the line, and demanded to speak to a senior security officer. When a polite officer named Julian arrived, Diane didn't ask him to ask the neighbors to turn the volume down. She demanded that he access the ship's mainframe, hack into the neighboring cabin's interactive television system, and permanently lock the volume control at a maximum of level 12. Julian stared at her, gently explaining that the televisions were not centrally networked for remote volume manipulation, and that he could not remotely hijack another passenger's electronics. Picture the exact moment a hospitality worker realizes they have to gently explain to someone deeply embedded in vacation mode that a cruise ship does not possess the technological capabilities of a futuristic sci-fi movie. Diane scoffed, leaned across the mahogany desk, and told Julian that if he was too afraid to execute a basic cyber attack, she would handle the situation herself. She stormed back to her cabin, pulled out her $1,000 smartphone, and downloaded a universal infrared remote control application. Her brilliant tactical plan was to step out onto her balcony, lean as far as humanly possible around the thick frosted glass privacy divider, and angle her phone to shoot an infrared beam directly through the neighbor's open balcony door to mute their television. Standing on her tiptoes, stretching her arm over the turbulent ocean, Diane frantically mashed the mute button on her screen. In her desperate attempt to find the exact angle, her sweaty fingers slipped. She watched in horror as her heavy, expensive smartphone tumbled from her grip, bounced off the metal railing, and landed squarely on the deck of the neighbor's balcony. The television next door continued to play loudly, completely unbothered. Diane's covert operation instantly collapsed, leaving her with no choice but to take the agonizingly humiliating walk back down to the front desk. She had to stand before Julian, the same security officer she had just insulted, and quietly ask if he could please call the neighbors she had just tried to digitally sabotage, and politely request that they hand back her phone. 6. The disruption of routine, combined with the high cost of a modern vacation, can occasionally cause a passenger to evaluate ancient history entirely through the lens of a modern consumer complaint, assuming that everything on Earth is a theme park managed by customer service. This exact phenomenon occurred at the shore excursions desk on a luxury vessel docked in Naples, courtesy of a retired couple named Keith and Diane. They had just returned from a highly anticipated, premium-guided tour of Pompeii, an experience they felt fell drastically short of basic hospitality standards. Bypassing the line entirely, Diane slammed her glossy shore excursion ticket onto the polished mahogany desk and demanded a 50% refund from a thoroughly exhausted guest services agent named Marco. When Marco politely asked what had gone wrong with their tour, Diane leaned in and stated, with absolute, unwavering sincerity, that the site was unacceptably dilapidated. She complained that the walkways were uneven, there was no air conditioning in the villas, and that the site management had clearly stopped maintaining the properties years ago. Imagine the absolute soul-crushing patience required to politely explain the concept of a catastrophic volcanic eruption in the year 79 AD to a tourist furiously tapping a bedazzled smartphone. Marco, staring blankly at the marble countertop, gently noted that the city was a preserved archaeological ruin, completely destroyed by Mount Vesuvius. Keith scoffed, crossed his arms, and argued that the cruise line's brochure called it a historic marvel, which he naturally assumed meant it had been renovated for modern tourists, much like a heritage hotel. They spent a full 10 minutes arguing that if the site's management wasn't going to bother fixing the roofs, the cruise line shouldn't be charging premium prices for the tickets, before eventually storming off to the buffet, completely baffled that an ancient archaeological dig lacked a proper facility manager. 7. The psychology of the vacation alpha is a deeply fascinating subject. This is a specific archetype of traveler who firmly believes that their personal financial success on land directly translates into absolute operational authority over international maritime logistics. This brings us to Richard, a 58-year-old regional sales director from Ohio who was sailing on a massive 3,000-passenger vessel with his wife Brenda and another couple, Steve and Mary. When the ship docked in the historic port of Dubrovnik, Croatia, Richard loudly refused to purchase the cruise line's official excursions, lecturing his friends at the breakfast buffet that the ship's tours were a scam for amateurs and that he would personally guide them through the city. The daily itinerary printed in bold, red ink that the ship was scheduled to depart at 5 p.m., and the mandatory all-aboard time for passengers was 4:30 p.m. At exactly 4:15 p.m., Richard and his group were sitting at a cliffside bar just outside the old city walls, roughly a 20-minute walk from the pier. Steve nervously tapped his watch, noting the time, but Richard simply laughed, ordered a third round of expensive local beers, and began delivering a masterclass in wildly inaccurate confidence. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and assured the table that a multi-million-dollar corporation would never leave without 4 paying customers. He confidently explained a completely fabricated maritime law, stating that as long as their luggage was physically inside their cabin, the captain was legally prohibited from starting the engines. If you have ever witnessed a grown man construct an entirely fictional reality simply because he doesn't want to admit he lost track of time, you understand the exact energy Richard was projecting. At 4:30 p.m., the ship's massive horn blasted through the port, a deep, vibrating warning that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Richard smiled smugly, told the group it was just a 30-minute courtesy chime, and pointed down at the pier, mocking the frantic passengers who were sprinting toward the gangway as sheep who fall for basic corporate fear tactics. At 4:50 p.m., the group finally paid their bill and began a leisurely, unhurried stroll down to the terminal. When they rounded the final corner at 5:05 p.m., Steve stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy metal gangway was gone. The thick mooring lines had been slipped, and the colossal vessel was already 100 yards away from the concrete pier, slowly rotating in the harbor. Richard, refusing to process reality, did not panic. He was simply annoyed. He marched up to the lone Croatian port agent standing on the dock and confidently demanded that the agent radio the bridge and deploy the VIP tender boat, fully believing that large cruise ships operated like private water taxis. The agent stared at him, shook his head, and informed them that the ship was gone, and their next port of call was a full sea day away in Greece. Richard attempted to bribe the agent with 50 euros, insisting there had to be a manager he could speak to before the agent calmly reached into his satchel and handed Richard a heavy manila envelope. Under standard maritime procedure, if a passenger misses the ship, the vessel's security team will access their cabin safe, retrieve their passports, and leave them with the port authority so the passengers can legally fly home or to the next port. Richard tore open the envelope, relieved to find their 4 passports inside. He turned to the group completely unfazed and declared they would just book a nice hotel in Dubrovnik for the night and fly to Athens in the morning. This is the exact moment the absolute devastation of his arrogance truly landed. His wife, Brenda, stared at the envelope, her face draining of all color, and reminded Richard of the strict mandate he had issued that morning. To avoid pickpockets and save on international roaming charges, Richard had ordered the entire group to lock their smartphones, their credit cards, and their wallets inside the cabin safe, insisting they only needed to carry enough cash for the day. But cruise ship security does not offload electronics or wallets. They only extract the legally required passports. Because Richard had insisted on buying that final round of drinks to prove his dominance over the ship's schedule, he had spent their last physical euros. The 4 of them were now standing on a concrete dock in Croatia, holding 4 passports, with 0 mobile phones, 0 credit cards, no way to contact their families, no way to book a hotel, and absolutely no money to buy a bottle of water. Thoroughly stranded in Europe by a man who thought he could outnegotiate a 150,000-ton ocean liner. 8. There is a very specific type of cultural short-circuit that occurs when certain North American travelers are suddenly confronted with high-end European bathroom fixtures. On a luxury Mediterranean sailing out of Rome, a 60-year-old retired accountant named Gary from Ohio had booked an extravagant owner's suite. This suite came equipped with a standalone ceramic bidet, a fixture Gary had never encountered in his life. Rather than asking his butler what the secondary, low-to-the-ground basin was for, Gary applied pure, unadulterated Midwest logic and determined it was a high-end maritime foot spa designed to soothe weary travelers after a long day of walking on cobblestones. On the second evening, Gary decided to treat himself. He sat on the edge of the marble bathtub, placed his heavily calloused feet into the bidet, and, wanting the full luxury experience, dumped half a bottle of complimentary peppermint bath salts directly over the drain. He then turned the water pressure knob to its absolute maximum. For those unfamiliar with the mechanics of a bidet, the water does not gently cascade from a faucet. It shoots directly upward. A high-pressure geyser of soapy, peppermint-infused water instantly rocketed past Gary's ankles, hit him squarely in the chest, and ricocheted across the bathroom, soaking the Egyptian cotton towels and flooding the floor. When the cabin steward responded to the frantic call for extra towels, he found Gary standing in a puddle of suds, entirely drenched from the sternum down, furiously complaining that the ship's European foot fountain was aggressively defective. 9. Behavioral economics frequently demonstrates that when a consumer is presented with a flat-rate promotion, they will completely abandon their dignity in a desperate quest to maximize the perceived value of the deal. Halfway through a 2-week Mediterranean itinerary, the cruise line offered a mid-voyage laundry special, delivering a standard, medium-sized paper bag to each cabin with a flyer stating that whatever garments a passenger could fit inside would be washed and folded for a flat fee of $30. To a rational person, this is a convenient way to clean a few shirts and some underwear. To Walter, a 65-year-old retired structural engineer from Seattle, this was a direct intellectual challenge issued by corporate management. Walter spent the entirety of his afternoon in Naples, ignoring the Italian coastline, opting instead to remain in his cabin to execute a deeply complex, high-stakes packing operation. He realized that the primary enemy of volume was trapped air, so he began utilizing a rolling technique he claimed was used by extreme minimalist backpackers, compressing his wife's sundresses and his own khaki shorts into incredibly dense fabric cylinders. When the paper bag reached its natural physical capacity, Walter refused to stop. Have you ever watched a man apply the principles of load-bearing architecture to a pile of dirty socks? He began systematically reinforcing the exterior walls of the cheap paper sack with multiple layers of clear medical tape from his first aid kit, effectively creating a rigid exoskeleton that allowed him to pack vertically, well past the rim of the bag. He then used his own body weight to press the garments down, while his wife desperately secured the top with a web of dental floss. By the time he was finished, Walter had successfully compressed a dense, solid 11 pounds of tightly coiled clothing into a paper sack designed to hold maybe 3 light t-shirts. The bag had the density of a bowling ball and looked like a heavily taped paper brick. Triumphant, Walter carried his monstrous creation down the narrow hallway to present it to his cabin steward, practically glowing with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just outsmarted the hospitality industry. However, Walter's brilliant engineering failed to account for one critical variable: the ambient humidity of the Mediterranean Sea. The cheap paper at the bottom of the bag, weakened by the moist sea air and the immense, pressurized force of the compacted garments, suddenly ruptured. The bag did not just tear, it structurally failed in spectacular fashion. The rigid tape shell snapped open, and the intense compression instantly reversed itself, rapidly unrolling the 11 pounds of fabric across the carpeted hallway. Socks, undergarments, and wrinkled polo shirts tumbled in every direction, leaving Walter standing completely motionless, holding nothing but a small ring of dental floss, ultimately forced to pay the individual per-item washing fee for every single piece of clothing he had just scattered across the elevator banks. 10. There is a certain breed of modern traveler who views a cruise ship not as a floating hospitality venue, but as a privately rented multi-million-dollar movie set designed exclusively for their social media presence. On the first formal night of a voyage departing from Venice, a couple in their early 30s decided they required a romantic, cinematic photograph on the ship's central atrium staircase, which was entirely covered in ornate glass crystals. The fundamental problem was that this staircase served as the primary transit artery for 4,000 hungry passengers actively trying to reach the main dining room. Instead of waiting for a quiet moment late at night, the couple simply positioned themselves in the center of the steps at 6:30 p.m., aggressively extending their arms like traffic cops to physically halt the flow of senior citizens in evening gowns. The husband, acting as a deeply intense amateur film director, began barking orders at the crowd, loudly demanding that a confused elderly man step out of the frame and telling a passing waiter carrying a tray of martinis to hold his position for lighting. They successfully blocked a major maritime thoroughfare for 10 full minutes, capturing dozens of identical photos, completely ignoring the massive, disgruntled queue of passengers forming on Deck 6. The situation only resolved when the ship's official photographer, who had been watching this amateur production with quiet professional patience, calmly walked over, turned off the decorative spotlights illuminating the staircase to change a bulb, and plunged the couple's perfect photo op into deeply unflattering shadows, causing them to storm off to the buffet, furious that the lighting department had completely sabotaged their masterpiece. 11. Group dynamics aboard a cruise ship can sometimes mutate into a bizarre, localized form of political theater, especially when passengers are confronted with the absolute authority of maritime weather protocols. A massive 4,000-passenger vessel was scheduled to dock in the Greek island of Mykonos, but overnight, the region was hit by the Meltemi winds, a very common, powerful Mediterranean wind system that makes navigating a colossal wall of steel into a tiny concrete harbor exceptionally dangerous. At 8 a.m., the captain made a polite public address announcing that, for the safety of the vessel, the port of call was cancelled and the ship would proceed to a scenic sea day instead. While the vast majority of passengers simply ordered another coffee and headed to the pool, Joanne, a 55-year-old homeowners association president from Texas, decided that the captain's assessment of maritime physics was entirely unacceptable. Because the sun was currently shining and the sky was blue, Joanne applied her neighborhood zoning logic to the Aegean Sea, determining that the wind was a corporate lie invented to save fuel. Joanne did not just complain to her husband. She immediately began organizing a literal democratic resistance movement from the starboard hot tub. By 10 a.m., she had rallied roughly 20 equally indignant passengers, convincing them that if they simply united and demanded their rights as paying consumers, the captain would be legally forced to turn the ship around. She drafted a formal list of passenger demands on the back of a blank bingo card, citing completely fabricated consumer protection laws. Joanne then led her furious, bathrobe-clad coalition on a slow, dramatic march down to the guest services desk on Deck 5, demanding an immediate audience with the captain and threatening to vote him out of his position if he did not dock the ship in Greece within the hour. I want you to really consider the sheer absurdity of having to look an angry passenger in the eye and politely inform them that an ocean liner is not a democracy and they cannot legally petition the wind. The guest services manager, a deeply seasoned British officer named Thomas, did not argue with her about the 60-knot gusts currently battering the hull. He understood that engaging with the logistics of ship navigation would only fuel her outrage. Instead, Thomas utilized a flawless psychological counterinsurgency tactic designed specifically for cruise passengers. He picked up his radio, whispered a code to the Culinary team, and then turned back to the angry mob. With a deeply sympathetic smile, he announced that the cruise line completely understood their frustration. And as a gesture of goodwill, the management had just opened an unscheduled, complimentary chocolate fondue fountain, complete with unlimited free mimosas, in the starboard dining room, available exclusively for the next 45 minutes. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating to Joanne's political movement. The sheer mention of free, time-limited chocolate completely shattered the structural integrity of the rebellion. The angry coalition of 20 passengers instantly dropped their grievances, turned their backs on their fearless leader, and aggressively power-walked toward the dining room to secure prime spots in the mimosa line. The entire mutiny evaporated in under 30 seconds. Joanne was left standing completely alone at the marble desk, clutching her bingo card of demands. She glared at Thomas, slowly lowered the paper, and asked if the chocolate fountain had strawberries or just marshmallows, before quietly folding her manifesto and walking off to join the line, thoroughly defeated by the undeniable power of free brunch. It's fascinating how the pursuit of a deal completely overrides self-preservation. Rational adults will gladly drink olive oil wine or detonate an 11-pound bag of laundry just to beat the system. Which mastermind do you think felt the deepest regret when reality hit? The wine smugglers or the laundry engineer? Subscribe if you want more dry breakdowns of human psychology unraveling.